So my name's Shintaro Kanaoya. I founded and run a company called Chorus, Chorus Worldwide Games, and it's been going for 5 years. And what we do is we publish Western indie games out into Asia. So we've been doing that, like I said, for 5 years. The games that you might know, one called The Room and The Room 2, The Adventures of Bertram Fiddle, which is like a bizarre Victorian point-and-click adventure game, and a bunch of other ones that you will never have heard of, and that's fine. And then in the last 2 years, we've done more console work. So we're doing stuff on everything on Switch, and then a subset of that also on PlayStation and Xbox. So, yeah.
Do you have any favorite kind of games that you guys look for?
No, we're genre agnostic. What we do try and do is just look for anything that wouldn't have been made by a developer in that country. So because we're a small company and one of the goals of the company has always been to champion indies, we look for things that are kind of unique and innovative and doing or saying something different. And hopefully that gives it a differentiating position as well in the market. So that's one of the things we look for. If it's something that's too samey, then we need a lot of, marketing firepower, especially on mobile, to cut above the noise. And that's just, we don't have the resources to bat at that level, like the previous guest or a bunch of other Japanese publishers like Gung Ho. We just don't have that firepower.
It makes sense. So if we're talking about games that are different from the Japanese market, so how do you see the Japanese market at the moment?
For mobile, well, I guess there's a reason why we're focusing more on console, and part of that is just it was getting the kind of games we were doing, like I said, like The Room and The Room 2, adventure games. They were more premium games, so if we weren't necessarily getting featured or getting promoted, and we were lucky enough that our first 20 or so games, everything was getting featured in every territory we were publishing in, which was great. But I think it got harder and harder, even with the features, the value of that just seemed to decrease. So, we were lucky enough that, in our case, Nintendo approached us and liked one of our games that we were showing, and so we started going in that direction. And what we were finding was the amount of time and effort it would take us to do one mobile game versus a console game was basically the same, but the ROI was much higher on console. And so we would be able to happily release a mobile premium game and basically make very little money for us and obviously very little revenue share for our the original developers. Whereas with console, we've been able to pay a revenue share for absolutely everything we've done, even the lowest performing stuff. So it just, from a business point of view, it just made, for us, more sense to pivot into that direction. But that's not to say we're not doing mobile, we're still doing mobile. But some of the stuff that we're doing is we're looking at mobile games or PC games and saying, well, how can we apply that? How can we port that? How can we make that into a console version where our strengths, our reach is more useful in Japan?
Is the Japanese market similar to Chinese and Korea in the sense of, if we talk mobile, about having a lot of free-to-play and premium has a smaller market, and then the competition is extremely hard. I'm using everything that Ken said in the presentation before, but is it the same or similar enough, the environment, or is it completely different?
It's similar and different. So it's similar in that it's dominated now by large free-to-play guys, and it's different in that all the titles are different. So I enjoy it when people talk about Asia, because from a games point of view, there's no real such place. There's Japan, there's China, and there's Korea, and the games that you see in the top grossing are completely different. And I remember looking at this a couple of years ago, and if you take Japan, China, and Korea, and you look at the top 20 top grossing games, so there's 60 slots, right? There were only, I think, 3 games that were in more than one country. Everything else was local publishers.
No, what the funniest is that people think Asia and they include India, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore into it.
It gets even more different, yeah.
Yeah, and then if you were compared India with Japan or...
No, even Japan and China, like I said, those three countries, which I think from a Western point of view, you kind of think of like Europe. Sure, if Europe is one entity and a lot of games are similar there, or North America, then surely Asia is the same. Asia is more different per country than Europe is or North America is, or even just the West. You'll see games in all of Europe and all of North America that are in the same, that, maybe, I'm trying to think, like obviously Fortnite, a bunch of games that we'll see, pretty much anything Supercell do will be in the top ranks of any, but in Asia, each country is different, and each country is massive in its own right. So maybe with the exception of someone like NetEase who has the power to kind of get to all the different markets, I think it's very hard, even for Japanese publishers, like people that have made Puzzle and Dragons or Colorpool with their stuff, they've had limited success in markets outside Japan. And they have all the money, all the resources to do all the localization, culturalization, and obviously the UA spend, but they're still not getting in there because the local makers and publishers are so strong. And also I think it just speaks to what you're more culturally comfortable with. And I think some of the differences in each of the markets has come up. So I think I caught the end of your talk about China didn't have a kind of a culture of paying for games before. Japan obviously maybe not fair to say it started, but console was a big part of the kind of gaming culture there. And the first real big hits were things like Dragon Quest. So RPGs has always been a massive part of that culture. And so if you look at what's really successful now, it's free-to-play RPGs made by Japanese manufacturers who understand what kind of gaming people were enjoying 20 years ago or what resonates with the market. In China, it's a different type of game. In Korea, it's more, they come from like the PC culture, more PvP culture. So those kinds of games are more successful. So I think you're starting to see differences in each market, and maybe not only, but the people best able to capitalize on that are the people locally to each market.
And is there interest from Western developers into Japanese market? Because we know that developers have this hype about China and the fair numbers and all, but a lot of people tend to ignore that Japan is one of the big three markets.
I blame the Japanese, and I'm being Japanese. I can do that because it's not racist.
Yeah, you do that.
But even when you come to events like this, I think you see a lot of Chinese publishers. You see a lot of Korean publishers. You very rarely see Japanese publishers and developers coming and reaching out. Not to say they're not here, but you don't often tend to see them. And I think that's part of it is that a lot of the Japanese publishers and makers are content with the Japanese market, and also know the challenges of what it takes to get outside. Puzzle and Dragons did make it into the US, and it did okay briefly, but it soon dropped out. And that's a game that's been number 1 or number 2 for about the last 6 years in Japan, and just making crazy amounts of money, but they weren't able to get out. So, you do see, I think part of, so I know you were asking about the other direction, Western games into Japan, but I think part of it is just the natural insularity that a lot of the Japanese developers, publishers have about bringing more stuff in. Obviously, our entire business is about trying to get Western content into Japan. And if I'm going to be completely honest, I think part of the reason it works for us is because we're a very small company and our cost base is quite low, and we keep that necessarily quite low. What works for us and what's profitable for us might not be for a bigger company. And so I think maybe that's part of it. But Japan is, the whole reason I started the company was because 6 years ago, I think, App Annie at the time released a report saying Japan had become the number 1 by revenue, overtaking the US. This is before China exploded. But I think Japan's still number 2 or number 3. And so you've got China, Japan and Korea, I think, are all in the top 5 or top 6, so, which is insane. But so obviously a lot of people want to get out there, but I would say that if you are thinking about getting out there, then you need to think about which country. And I'm not trying to exclude countries that aren't Japan or China or South Korea, but those are the 3 major ones.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that, but one thing I wanted to comment, it's also that the part that it makes it easier for you to work with us Western developers to bring it to Japan is also because you have been internationally effective. So you have been traveling around the world, meeting developers. You are Japanese, but you don't have a fully Japanese.
I'm fake Japanese, yeah.
You don't have a full Japanese business way of thinking.
I'm what's offensively called a banana. Does anyone know that term? A banana? So yellow on the outside, white on the inside. Because I was born in Japan, but I grew up in, London. So, yeah.
Again, he said that. I didn't.
Again,
whatever
okay.
He says,
I have a Japanese passport. I can say it. It's not racist.
If I say it's going to
You can't say it. I can say
it. But because I think a lot of developers still have that fear of the Japanese way of negotiating deals and contracts and how things are going to go, and they think it's going to take forever. And
most of the time it does. And I mean, we did so as well as publishing, we do some, I guess, what we would call consulting work, where we've helped other companies do business in Japan. And in a licensing deal we did for a very large company. It took 3 months for the NDA, right? And that's just because that particular company still deals everything in paper. And this was a company in London that wanted to work with them, so we were just sending bits of, and they would, I think they got the date wrong once. You lose 2 weeks, right, because of that. So that can happen, but a lot of modern, newer Japanese companies are much better.
Oh, you're talking about a country that still needs stamps.
Yeah, but most countries still need stamps, don't they?
No, and I understand. I explain this because this is the reason why I'm presenting this is because I used to live in Japan, and my first surprise is besides the signature, you have to have a personalized stamp, which is what you use for every official document.
The seal, yeah, the seal, yeah, hanko, yeah.
So it was my biggest surprise to know Japan, one of the most developed countries in the world, technology above everything, and you need a stamp.
It's no more ridiculous than a signature, if you're honest, though. A signature is kind of a ridiculous thing to...
It cost me 200 euros to do that damn seal. Okay, joke aside, I'm very sorry. What are the biggest mistakes that Western developers make when they try to reach the Japanese market?
Not working with us, maybe? I don't know. No, I think it's just not knowing what they're doing, right? So even something as simple as localization, which often seems like a boring subject, but it's amazing how bad localization can be done. And so you can do bad localization where it's just like a Japanese person will look at it and go, I don't know what they're trying to say here. You can do really bad localization where someone can read it and it's offensive. So we had to help out on a game which had been translated, and it was a fantasy game where the word dwarf had been translated into Japanese as the word kobito. Does anyone speak Japanese here? Okay, so kobito means dwarf, technically, but there's two problems with it. One, for a fantasy game, you don't say kobito, you say dwarf, just like a phonetic translation. Two, the word kobito is now un-PC. So someone that understands Japanese had clearly translated it, they'd just done it all wrong for this particular game. So it's that old thing of a little knowledge is really dangerous, and this is exactly that case. So we've had a few of those cases where we looked at it. We had to help another partner out who, one of the app stores it was a Google Play Store in one of the territories had said, look, we want to help you with your game, but the translation isn't good enough. And so we went back and we had to fix all that because our Korean translators are very good. And it's stuff like that it is that unknown. I love my Donald Rumsfeld stuff. The unknown unknowns that kill you. You think you've done a good job, but you have no idea of knowing unless you have a trusted partner. So I think that's one of the hardest things. That's probably the number one thing I would say is just.
I would say also the UI like localization, because Japanese have a very specific way that they like their user experience to be presented to them.
That's sure. I think there's a concept, but not just UI, but I guess onboarding and the first time user experience, all that kind of stuff. There's a word in Japanese called shinsetsu, which means to be like kind to the user. And I think a lot of A lot of Western games aren't. They just like, actually, I mean, the most unshinsetsu probably is a Japanese game like Bloodborne or Dark Souls. They just go, there you go, you're going to die straight away. We're going to fucking kill you over and over again because we don't care. But that's like the polar opposite of what most Japanese games do, which is lead you very gently into the experience. And I think a lot of the times Western developers tend to just assume a certain level of knowledge. And even if, I'm not saying Japanese gamers don't have that level of knowledge, but what they want is that reassurance that, yes, what they're doing is right. And that's not always necessarily there. So I think that's one of the things that if you were going to modify your game and you wanted to, for whatever reason you wanted to focus on Japan, then that's a good thing to think about.
And I know you're working with a lot of platforms, not only mobile anymore, but Switch, with PC, with everything. How would you advise developers work? Like, if you are a multi-platform developer, or you can port your games in different platforms, how should the developers work with? Do you understand what I mean?
I think you should also always, if you can, have multi-platform in mind. Obviously, that doesn't. If you're making a very pure mobile free-to-play, then that's very, very hard. If you're not, then I think it's absolutely worth thinking about multi-platform, because in the age of Unity and UE4 and stuff, why wouldn't you? And it's actually the incremental cost to get to another platform, if you've got a game that's suitable, is very low. And I don't understand when people don't have that in their business model from the beginning, because it's that extra 5% cost could be an extra 50% revenue, right? So what it just, to me, makes intrinsic sense to do that. And sometimes it is just about they don't have the budget or they don't have the time. Often those two things are the same. And so we'll take on the porting. So we've ported a couple of games, about 5 actually. And honestly, I'll put my hand up and say a lot of the porting is pretty much straight porting. But being able to reach a whole new audience is great, not just from a commercial point of view, but also from seeing the game on a big screen, if you like, or having players being able to experience it in a different way. Playing an adventure game like Bertram Fiddle, which is like an old style LucasArts point and click game. If you're playing on a PC, you're probably playing by yourself. But it's a great game to play in a living room with a bunch of friends, right? Because you should do that, do this, and stuff, and it becomes a more social thing. So I think as people think about that kind of living room social aspect, that's a whole new dimension you get just by putting it onto one new platform. So to me, it makes. I don't know why you wouldn't do that if you have the opportunity.
That makes sense. I exploded the time. So then. My last question to finish this is, we already defined that the best steps for them to be successful in Japan is talking to you, localizing the game, and doing multi-platform.
Sure.
Anything else
is that what I said?
Missing?
Okay. That sounds like something I'd say. No, I mean, I think obviously this is Pocket Gamer. Most people are primarily focused on mobile, so some of the stuff I'm saying isn't relevant. I would just say, I think, when we were more focused on mobile, what I would say is don't build your game to focus on like the Asian market, because you don't know the Asian market. So, and not just from a monetization point of view, from a culturalization point of view. Why, as a Western developer sitting in Seattle or wherever, why would you suddenly go, I'm going to focus on China, unless you have some incredible insight into China that Chinese developers don't have and Chinese publishers don't have? Why would you focus on that? Absolutely focus on first of all, focus on an audience, which too many people don't do. They just want to make their game. Okay, well, that's great, but no one's going to play it, but that's fine. Focus on an audience, and then whether that's a genre or a territory, focus on that. And then if there is an opportunity to expand to a different market, then absolutely keep it in the back of your mind. But don't start diluting your design a little bit for China, a little bit for the West, because then it's not really going to serve anyone.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And I'm sorry again, I exploded all the time possible, but they can reach out for you out of state.
Absolutely.
Please give a big hand to Shin.
Thank you.